We were barreling toward the center of Andromeda. With no engine, we were as good as dead, and I thought we might be swallowed by the black hole in the galaxy's center. But to my surprise, we were slowing down. Dust and fine debris from the outskirts of the galaxy was crinkling against the windshield. Our speed kept dropping, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to see. What felt like hours passed before we made it out of the dust cloud, and at last we were greeted with a close-up view, the warmth of billions of stars swirling around an absence of light. The ship's radar sometimes picked up large bodies out here, asteroids or possibly planets floating around in interstellar space, but we were still moving 2.5 times faster than the ship was designed to go, so these objects would appear only as blips before disappearing forever. We saw them sometimes out the front window as shadows over the stars. Many more hours passed and we were nearly within the plane of the galaxy. We were expecting to pass through and then float off into space forever. There were enough food supplies to last maybe 2 or 3 weeks. James and I discussed it, and we figured we might as well try to have a party before we starve to death. But if this is the last light we ever see, we might as well stay in the cockpit until it passes. There was a shadow growing over the stars at the top of the window. It appeared to get larger at an increasing rate until we could see no light. Warnings flashed across the dash that we were approaching a massive object, but not massive enough to be a black hole. The ship's computer wasn't sure whether or not we would hit it, as it was moving too quickly to do the calculations properly. James and I gave each other a sullen look and braced for impact. We could feel the pull of the object. It must have been a brown dwarf, another rogue planet, and if we were accelerating this hard toward it, we must have been close. A fresh peppering of dust broke across the windshield as we grazed its thin atmosphere. Sparks flew as the trillions of tiny impacts friction caused flame. We could see nothing but fire, and were being pushed deep in our seats from the centripetal force. But to my surprise, it was becoming lighter. Gradually, the flames were thinning, and out the front window we could see a field of stars below us. We were just over the plane of the galaxy, flying perpendicular to it. The billions of solar systems formed a line of light as we looked to what would be the horizon. The swirling black hole in the center of Andromeda, still a ways away, looked ominous, the lord of this astral plane with stars whizzing around it near the core. A bright white star lay just before us, and we were entering an asteroid field that sat within its domain. We had only just escaped the pull of the brown dwarf, and we had slowed down considerably. The star ahead was casting an eerie light between the rocks. Something about them looked fluid. Many of them looked freshly shattered, and dust scattered about the space around highlighted sunbeams. Whoa, did you see that? James asked me. What? See what? He leaned in closer to the window. There's something moving on that one. Where? Which one? James pointed to a large asteroid about 10,000 kilometers up. I joined him, leaning in closer, but couldn't see any movement myself. If it was small, it wouldn't appear on the radar, but I checked anyway. Then, something hit the front window. What was that? I asked James. Just a small asteroid. He reassured me. But it was followed by another, similar sound on the port side of the hull, and another on the starboard side. It began to sound like rain as small projectiles hit the ship from all sides. I panicked and looked to the radar for answers, but whatever the objects were, they were too small to detect. Oh my god, James was pointing to something out the front window. I traced the invisible line drawn by his finger and saw something standing on an asteroid. It had 2 sets of arms and 2 sets of legs, and it was hunched way over, gripping the rock with both pairs of claws. What little neck it had was being used to prop its head up against its back, nearly 180 degrees to look at us. It had a loose webbing between its claws, and its face was permanently in a scowl. It lifted a chunk of asteroid to its mouth and took a bite with its blackened teeth, chewing on half of it as it hurled the other half towards my ship. From the darkness, another of these creatures leapt onto the windshield. It held a sharpened rock in its claw and began hacking away, but the glass was too hard for its claws to dig in, and gradually it slipped off. I didn't feel too worried as I knew the hull was strong, but I was in awe of these creatures. Somehow, they were able to live in space. I got up from my seat and ran to the kitchen window at the back of the ship to see what would become of that attacker. It was flapping its limbs behind the ship, trying to propel itself forward, swimming slowly through space by pushing off the bits of dust with its webbing. "Nick, come back here, you gotta see this," I heard from the cockpit. Thousands of the creatures were jumping on the ship. We were being swarmed. Our speed was continuing to drop, and now I was getting concerned. Some creatures missed their mark as they leapt toward the ship, but it seemed they were able to pop off their limbs in order to rebound in space. The creatures seemed to be about as intelligent as some of the smarter animals on Earth, and I knew that if our ship came to a standstill, with enough time they would figure out a way to breach it. As I racked my brain trying to think of a way out of this, a bright light shone through the cracks between creatures in the front window. Instantly, they scattered, hiding behind asteroids. Standing on an asteroid a little further ahead was a new creature. It looked similar to those that had swarmed the ship, but it was much taller, and it stood upright. It had more subtle facial features and a more dignified expression as well. It held in its hands a rod with a glass circle on top, a lens, focusing the star's rays like a magnifying glass to burn away at the lesser beings. Once it saw that it had our attention, it bowed and pointed down to our right to where a little planet sat a couple million kilometers away. This creature was clearly more intelligent and made me feel significantly more uneasy. We had no engine and no choice but to continue drifting straight ahead. The creature noticed this and deepened its bow, climbing onto its knees and lowering its head. How did it know this gesture? Or was it another gesture that I was misinterpreting for a bow, based on my own Earth bias? Either way, I could only stare in silence, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. A couple other upright creatures appeared on distant asteroids, and they began doing the same, bowing, folding their hands, gesturing to the planet below as though they were begging us to go there. I began to feel guilty. Who wouldn't want to be the first to make contact with a friendly, intelligent alien species? As the ship sailed on straight ahead, they were getting desperate. They leapt between asteroids much faster than their hunched counterparts, and were keeping ahead of the ship. We were nearing the end of the asteroid field, and with nowhere left to leap, they all stood next to each other on the furthest from us in our line of sight. I felt terrible, but I couldn't look away as they began clawing at themselves, ripping away at their faces and guts. We watched two of them die, and the last living creature decapitated it with its claws. It gouged its eyes and hollowed out its skull, planted the rod of the large magnifying glass into the asteroid, and pointed the light through the back of its comrade's face. The shape of a pained eyes and mouth shone into deep space, perpendicular to the plane in which Andromeda sat, and finally, the remaining creature took its own life, ripping its guts and throat apart like the others. In its last moments of life, it flung its body against the front window of my ship, marking it with its green blood.